Hello, everybody. You're very welcome to this block, which is looking at just transition. I hope you enjoy it. I hope you get something out of it. And my job is just to introduce it and give you some initial ideas to work with. My name is Mark Garavan. I lecture in the ATU in Castlebar, but I'm also a director of an environmental group called FASTA, which is the Foundation for the Economics of Sustainability. And in that group, we've been thinking about this matter for the best part of 20 or 30 years at this stage, trying to understand what a sustainable society might look like, what a sustainable economy would look like. Now, this block is on just transition. So let's just think a little bit about that and what we mean by it. Let's start with the word transition. What do we mean by that? So this refers to that we need to move from the current way in which we do business and do economics and do our society to something new and something different. So we have to transition from the way things are to the way things need to be. Now, at this stage, from other parts of the SDG module, you're getting a sense of why. Why do we need to make that transition? And it's really elementary. The system that we currently have is no longer working. It's not fit for purpose. It's producing too many negativities and producing too much harm. So keeping the system exactly as it is and maintaining it into the future is not really a viable option. In other words, what we sometimes call business as usual, BAU, is not a very viable option. It may be very attractive not to have to change anything. It may be very appealing if we could just leave things as they are and just learn the skills for keeping the whole thing going. But it ultimately doesn't work. Why not? Business as usual, or the way the system currently is giving rise to two huge problems, neither of which are sustainable, and both of which will cause ultimately the system to collapse anyway. So here are the two problems. The first one is business as usual, our current economic model, is producing vast amounts of inequality. And global inequality is a primary undermining of sustainability, in the sense you can't keep having highly unequal societies or a highly unequal globe and expect that this can just continue on. There's a whole bunch of reasons why that can't be, not least of which is an economic reason. If more and more people have less and less money, then they're unable to make what are called economic demands. So the free market system won't produce the goods and services that they need because they simply can't pay for it. Whereas if you have a very small number of people with more and more money, then the economic demands that they have, the free market system will adjust to meet those needs, simply because they have the money to pay for it. So you get a complete skewing of resources from most people to a smaller and smaller elite at the top, with more and more physical resources being devoted to their needs and wants. So whereas most people might need water and housing and food, because they don't have the economics to pay for it, that won't happen. But if a tinier number of people at the beginning want yet more mobile phones and smart televisions and electric cars and yachts and even space rockets, then that's what will happen. So you get this very poor distribution of resources with more and more misery at the bottom and more affluence at the top. So inequality is a very bad model for long-term continuity. The world we live in is profoundly unequal. It may not look that way very obviously to us, because we may think the world is made up of middle-class people, but when you step back and take a look at the global picture, you can see a much different reality. So that's one problem, inequality. Second problem is sustainability itself, or ecological balance. So we know that our current system at this stage represents nothing short of death to our global world. It is destroying habitats because it needs more and more land for productive purposes. It's using up vast amounts of resources of all kinds because it's making more and more things to sell. Its energy is driven by largely carbon fossil fuels, and the effect of that is to release vast amounts of carbon into the atmosphere, which is trapping the Earth's heat, raising global temperatures, and having a whole series of knock-on effects throughout the global ecology. So we have a huge habitat crisis, we have a loss of biodiversity, and we have a climate change event currently underway and not necessarily under control either. We have some illusion that we may still be able to control it. Chances are it's already running its own course and is really beyond our ability to manage it. So we have very profound systemic problems. So we have huge inequality combined with a massive ecological breakdown. The current system is not designed to fix either of these problems. It can't do it. Why not? Because at the core of our current system is the need to maintain economic growth. Our current economic system, the dominant economic system in the West, in all its various forms of capitalism and even of socialisms, are all predicated on endless economic growth. They're all organized to achieve growth. They're all organized to bring about more growth. They're all organized to celebrate growth. So the more economic growth, the better the economy, the more money is in circulation, the more goods and services are being bought and sold, the more employment there is, the more money people have, and so on. So it's all predicated on this notion of growth. And growth comes because of the design of our money system. That's too complicated to get into just now. But essentially, our money system is based on debt, where we borrow money that doesn't exist at the moment, borrow it from the future, give it to people in the present, hoping that they will make that money by their present activity so that these loans can then be repaid and then the money is created. So we're drawing down vast amounts of money from the future, pouring it into the present so that people in the present can consume and invest and make things and do things. All of this is great, except that this vast amount of money being drawn down is producing the two problems we've talked about: huge inequality and huge ecological breakdown. So this system cannot continue. It has to be replaced. Now, the issue is how and what. So this is what we mean by transition, moving from one system to another system. The just transition, so this is the second part of our title, the just transition, recognizes that it's very important if we do that everyone is included in it and largely everyone benefits. Because many transitions in the past have really benefited just a small number of people. And there's always a temptation to do a transition today that equally leaves certain people behind. So certain very reformist ideas about this transition can fall foul of this problem. Simple example, let's imagine we decide a big problem is the burning of fossil fuels. So how will we stop that? Well, how about we put more and more taxes on fossil fuels, making them more and more expensive? This sounds like a good idea, except that if you do that and you make oil and gas more expensive, then heating is more expensive, electricity is more expensive, and so on. The problem is with this is that those who have lots of money can absorb this price increase, and those who have relatively little money cannot, and they suffer even more. So the effort to fix what appears to be an environmental problem by increasing the price of fossil fuels may actually even further increase the other problem, social inequality. So the just transition is centered around taking these two core problems, on the one hand inequality and on the other ecological breakdown, and combining them so that we attempt to fix both problems together. We don't do a trade-off between them. So sometimes with some of the proposals we've had over the last few years, it looks as if we're favoring ecological breakdown and giving rise to greater inequality. And of course, this has the effect then of making many, many people in Western democracies positively hostile towards environmental decisions because they think that they're losing out if we bring about environmental reform. So just transition is about looking at these two issues and solving them together. So we transition from our current growth-centered economic model into a degrowth model where we start to try and reduce consuming and reduce the role of debt money, and at the same time attempt to ensure that there is better and better equality. Now, how can we do this? What is the way to do this? So there are many different suggestions and many different proposals. Let me just mention two that you can consider and think about and read about. One is the notion of guaranteed basic income, where you simply give everybody who lives in a country a minimum wage, a minimum guaranteed income, irrespective of whatever work they do. And this income is pitched so as to give you a reasonably good standard of life. And then you need to combine that with public services that are accessible and largely free for people, such as healthcare and so on. So in other words, the state looks after all its people, and then people can work as they wish and generate income above and beyond that. But nobody gets left behind, and everyone has the resources to participate as fully as possible in the social world. So that's one possibility. How would you pay for such an idea? Well, that's the second idea then, and I've given you an article to read on this. It's a little bit technical and a little bit complicated. I hope it's not too tedious, because at the core of it is a very interesting idea. So it's called cap and share. So in this idea, every country can put a cap on the amount of carbon that gets used in the country. So people have a certain budget. They're allowed to use that amount of carbon. And if they use more than that, then they have to pay for it. And that money that is paid for is then taken by the state and distributed to those who use less than their carbon allocation. So essentially what we're trying to do here is create a limit on the amount of carbon resources being used, generate a large amount of income from that, and take that income and distribute it to those at the bottom end of society. Because poorer people, on average, will tend to use less carbon resources than very wealthy people. So there's a redistributive mechanism going on in this type of proposal. So this is a very simple proposal. I mean, I've given it to you in very simple terms. There's a lot of different elaborations of it. But the idea, again, is to bring about really radical change in terms of the way that our economy and world works, but combines that with ensuring greater equality. So the end point of the just transition idea is to move from our current very dysfunctional model, which is not working, to imagine up a world where there's greater equality, so people can participate more equally in what's going on, and a world in much greater ecological balance, where we've less resource pollution and resource exploitation and biodiversity loss and a much more stable climate regime, if we can achieve that in the coming decades. So this is about the future that you want, and it's about the world that is a more amenable world to live in. It might be a bit less for those who dream of having huge incomes and whose understanding of life is flying around the world and going on endless foreign holidays and owning all the latest gadgets. But it's an awful lot better world for the 90% of the global population who want guaranteed food, guaranteed accommodation, guaranteed healthcare, and so on. So for most human beings, a just transition represents a movement to a far better world, one that's more human and also more ecological. So I hope that's clear, and I hope it makes sense, and I hope the reading is not too bad for you. So thank you.